Thanks so much for joining us. Today here I have Rob Chambers, the VP of Product from Lightspeed Systems, to discuss with me really web proxies and kind of the ways that kids are getting around inappropriate content. I'm Matthew Berg. I'm the Principal Product Manager for Lightspeed Filter. So very excited to have this conversation and get some insight from you and also share some of what I've learned over the years as well, not just in regards to kind of the vulnerabilities and things that kids try to jump in on to figure out ways to access inappropriate content, but also to really talk about what are we doing about it, right? And some of the cool, exciting technologies that our filter offers, as well as one of the products we're launching here soon. So, without further ado, just kind of jumping in, Rob, I guess if you had to kind of say like what would you say is the number one sort of way that kids are trying to really get past filtering and look at inappropriate or otherwise restricted content?
Yeah, this is something that has been an issue for as long as we've been in the filter business and as long as schools have been filtering. And the methods tend to recycle. So we see, whether it's an application that you try to run that tries to generate a VPN or proxy tunnel out to, websites that are hosting and appear to be, valid sites at the beginning, but then, on the back end, they're proxying content. Um, and it goes up and down, right? So right now we're seeing an increase in the web hosted proxies where kids are trying to get to a site and do that. But it shifts, it just swings between applications on the disk and web proxies, and um, kids are just constantly looking for any way to get to content that they're being blocked from, whether it's for distracting or security or other SIPO reasons.
I guess can you dig a little bit more into that? I think, we obviously, can say something's, getting past the filtering policy, right? But what are some of the risks? What are some of the issues that occur when kids are able to get to this type of content?
Sure. I mean, number one, obviously, is distracting. They're either distracting themselves or other students, attempting to bring up content in the classroom or at school that um, shouldn't be there. And again, and some of that is just, they want to get to social media and play TikTok videos or that kind of thing. Or, you know, or they want to go even further. They want to play games or they want to get to some mature content and things. And we see the whole spectrum. But along with that, the kids aren't very discerning about where they're grabbing this content, where they're playing that game from. And so, yeah, if they are doing these things, you're opening yourself up to potential security vulnerabilities if they're going to a site that might be compromised in other ways. All they care about is do they get to the content that they want? But are they opening security risks and things in your environment?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that to your point, I think that security piece of it is something that is often probably overlooked or maybe not thought of as directly because, you're losing the ability to see where they're going, right? Because you're no longer able to track that web activity anymore. But they don't have the experience to know what is or isn't a safe source for things, for downloading files
Mhm.
or whatever it may be. So I think that's a good call out. I think one that had come up for me recently that I wanted to just kind of jump into was actually like when you, something is designed to try to crash a filter, right? I think we've seen this recently. There's was an exploit that we actually recently made a patch for ourselves regarding. I think it was called Hanger was one of them,
Mhm.
but like using vulnerabilities in an operating system, right? Whether it's trying to gain elevated privileges, we've seen that on Windows in the past or otherwise, or trying to crash an extension, because there's ways that you can get at some of these things, maybe in Chrome OS or otherwise. And I think all of these sort of fundamentally come back to that same problem, right? Where, at the end of the day, once that's happened, once they found a way past it, they're really in this space now where there's no safety. And these are devices on your network that, whatever happens to them could very quickly spread to everything else, on that network, right? It certainly poses a pretty big safety risk there. So, um, yeah, I guess, thinking about these types of things, I guess before we move on, is there any other sort of bypasses that kind of come to mind? Anything else that hops up for you?
No, I mean, really, it comes down to that. Either they are, trying to launch some sort of application to either create some kind of tunnel, whether it's a proxy or VPN. The end result is largely the same. Some kind of tunnel out web proxies, or like you said, somewhere some attempt to completely bypass the protections on the device. And when they do that, they're typically not only bypassing the filter security, but they're oftentimes compromising the firewall and AV that runs on these machines and the anti-malware and all of that, and leaving the machine in a very vulnerable state.
Yeah, yeah, but not good. I guess talking about kind of what Lightspeed is doing about this, right? I think this is something that has obviously been a very important topic to myself when we think about it on the filter side. It's obviously important to Lightspeed overall. There are a couple things that we've seen that, these are older tricks. We don't see them as much anymore, but I think it's also important to call out, for example, why we try to protect against visiting when you're trying to visit IPs directly, right? And making sure that we don't just allow that, right? There's a reason why when we put our agents on devices, right, we're protecting for things beyond just a DNS level, right? That's obviously a really old school trick to try to get around filters, but also just trying to create websites that look educational but aren't, right? We've seen that plenty of times as well. So something we've been working on, it's a constant work in progress, right? But Lightspeed's approach to this, and specifically Filter's approach to this, is really one where we try to be very proactive, but also very consistent and predictable. One of the things we see, a lot of technologies emerging now in the world of AI and things along those lines that are trying to leverage these to find and block proxies, which is obviously a very important thing for the reasons that you just talked about. But I think one of the challenges that we in the industry have when we're thinking about education is, how do we make sure that everybody's getting the same experience, the same every time? So, Lightspeed's approach, what we've been doing is kind of taking these same technologies and applying them on the kind of the cloud side, right? You think about categorization of
Mhm.
websites. When people are going to these websites, we're saying, okay, let's scan this, let's see what's going on, and then everybody gets to use that knowledge, that same knowledge, rather than kind of just running it locally on the device and risking that inconsistency, right? None of these technologies are perfect. um, and that training process, that process of building out that technology is very important, because false positives are one of those things where something can look, even to a human eye, right? But fortunately, when you think about proxies, when you think about web proxies especially, um, they have a lot of fingerprints to them that you can't see, to your eye visually. When you think about how a website's programmed and developed, in order for it to function as a proxy, you have these different services behind the scenes. So there's a lot of interesting things that Lightspeed does there to try to stay ahead of that. Of course, one of the big things we do is we allow people to block unknown websites, right? These things are getting created constantly by students, and ultimately, this is a piece that, when we're looking at how do you keep your district safe, or your organization safe, it really comes down to, don't allow things that you don't know, and then have a very powerful system categorizing the content that you do know, so that way you know that you're as protected as you can possibly be. So these are certainly
And
been.
that's oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead,
I was
please.
going to
No,
say
please
that's
jump
really
in.
key. That no, I was going to, because if you don't have that powerful and comprehensive database on the back end, using all the techniques you were just talking about, then you can't block unknowns, right? And what we find across our customer base is that it is the standard by far that the students are blocked from unknowns, because you can do that safely. You're not over blocking. You're not preventing content they need to get to, but you are stopping this, because so many of these are very short lived. They pop up, they're there for a period of time, and then they're recycled to a new domain, new IP, and everything else almost daily. I know
Yeah.
we talk about this a lot, but there are Discord boards and there are Reddit channels and there are subreddits and things that are out there that just are constantly recycling. Oh, we moved here, we moved here. Now we sit in on those too and use those to make our process better. But that unknown blocking, as simple as it sounds, is really one of the key things to your security. But that only works if you have that comprehensive database backing it up.
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually you brought up a really interesting one there. There's a site afraid.org that kind of houses, it's one of many, but it's just a good example. They house a bunch of what we call shared domains, essentially
Mm-hmm.
where people who do pay for domain space, they have their own domain name, allow anybody to create subdomains and websites off of them, which is very dangerous, right? Because you do think about categorization, you do think about how we analyze a website to say if it's safe or not. If anybody can then start adding and modifying content underneath and within that website, right, it does create a danger. And so, something else that we've done more recently, within the last year, in fact, is actually launch a category for domain sharing websites, and then we actually sit in on those, like you say, but also we monitor these sort of repositories of shared domains, and we go through and are regularly, actually, more than once a week, even going through and making sure that we're caught up on those. Because I think that's the other piece to this. I mentioned that idea of like creating a educational looking site. Sometimes it's not even that malicious. Sometimes we saw an example where the person made a website, they were a hobbyist, and they were selling guitars, but they also decided to post their site for other people to use domain space. And so they had over 10,000 subdomains from different
Yeah.
users created off a guitar, like a personal guitar shopping site. That wasn't their intent, but that's the result from these kinds of activities that people aren't really aware of. So it's obviously a forever fight, but that's at least on the filter and categorization, at least some of what we do, and kind of, I think, you know trying to get deeper into how we solve this problem. There's always more we're looking to do and to make this even more bulletproof, but I think the approach at least is something that we're very proud of. But that said, I think there's another layer to this. Obviously, I mentioned at the start we have this new product launch upcoming for Signal, and I've heard some rumors that it also does some things related to security and even to VPNs. You mind just giving us a little Signal spiel and tell us a little bit about what it can do for us?
Sure. So, filter is obviously looking at, the device and what traffic is heading out of that device in order to, allow you to maintain your HIPAA compliance and your security practices and everything else. But what we've done with Signal is we are looking at the health of your environment and communicating that to you, focusing on three things initially. And one of those is the device health. Now, device health, at one level is things like, is it charged up? Is the disk, at capacity, or those kinds of things. Some basic, information about that. But we go much further than that with things like, well, one, is the device being used by the correct user? Because sometimes, people will grab their friend's device to try to use that is the device they're trying to bypass filter on, thinking that they won't get caught, or those kinds of things, or their friend might get blamed or whatever. And so we're going to report on things like that. But because we are looking at the device level, we also see things like, okay, this kid has installed a VPN or proxy application, and is using that to attempt to bypass the filter. Now, that still works in conjunction with the filter, which is doing all of its work to block all that activity. But now, because we're looking at it through a different viewpoint, we can tell you, hey, this student is attempting to do this, and give you alerts and things like that.
That's very cool. Yeah, that's interesting because to your point, right? A web proxy, when you're looking at it through a website perspective, that traffic is still coming from the same device's IP. Nothing's changing
Mhm.
there. The website they're visiting is the culprit. But that's different than if they do successfully get like a VPN application, or they get set up with an anonymous proxy on the device. Now the source of their traffic has a different IP,
Right.
right? And they're coming from a different location. So that's really cool. You mentioned the user switching as well. I think that's definitely an important thing to call out. Um, yeah, I mean, I think really what this kind of indicates to me when we think about how we try to tackle this problem, right? It's not just a matter of what's on the filter. To your point, device health, some of these other things matter because things that are abnormal are really often the indicators of where to look and to know that a problem might occur. Um, so I think obviously it sounds pretty exciting, at least from my
Mhm.
perspective.
Yeah.
But I guess kind of curious whether it's with Signal, whether I know we have some things we do with our Insight product when it comes to apps and identifying what people are using. I guess, do you have any kind of like closing thoughts about kind of the topic and how kind of all of our Lightspeed products are working to tackle or combat this problem?
Yeah, I mean, it is it's there's no one magic thing to do, right? Obviously, if there was, we would have done that in Filter a long time ago. There are many things that students are doing. I mean, we have students that we all have users all day that have nothing but time and motivation. Uh, and
For sure.
so it's a unique environment. You don't see this in other industries and other types of deployments. If you have employees that are doing bad things, you deal with that as an employee matter. But generally we can't fire students. They're here, and we have to work with them and get them educated. And so along the way, this is part of that, and all the digital citizenship and everything that goes there. But there's not just one approach. You need to look at it in multiple layers. So you need to look at what's going on the internet. What does their activity look like? What is their what's happening on their device? What's happening on their internet connectivity? Another thing that Signal monitors and will give you health status on is, how is their internet connectivity and how's that going? Or the apps. While Insight gives you like historical data of your app usage, Signal will also monitor those apps in real time and the health of those apps. And all of that helps you complete the picture. So it's not just one piece, right? You need to know what's going on the device. You need to know what's going on the internet. You need to know what's going on with your apps. You need to filter. You need Classroom to tell you what's going on in the Classroom tool and what those kids are doing in real time as they're working with the teacher. So there's no one piece, right? There's so many layers that you need a platform like Lightspeed that brings you all of those things together so that you can effectively keep the kids on task, not distracted, and doing the things that they should be doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Really appreciate you taking the time. I realize this is pretty quick, but it was great to get to chat through this topic with you for a bit. And I hope that anybody out there watching got something valuable out of this conversation as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Matt.